The morning the divorce was finalized, I sat in my car in the parking lot of the courthouse and I counted what I had left. A 2009 Honda Civic with a cracked windshield, $43 in my checking account, and a storage unit full of furniture and boxes and picture frames that didn't mean anything anymore. That was it. 22 years of my life. That's what I walked away with. And Richard, my ex-husband, he walked out of that courthouse with his chest up and his attorneys behind him, and he had this look on his face, this tight little smile, like he had just won something, like the whole thing had gone exactly the way he planned. And maybe it had. But here's what Richard never knew. Here's what nobody knew. There was an account he never found, and that account changed everything. My name is Caroline Whitfield, and this is my story. I grew up in Dayton, Ohio. My father was an electrician. My mother worked in a school cafeteria. We weren't poor, but we were careful. We knew what things cost. I grew up understanding that money was not something you wasted, not something you showed off, and definitely not something you talked about at the dinner table. I was the kind of kid who kept a notebook. Seriously, from the time I was about 12 years old, I wrote down every dollar I saved. Birthday money, babysitting, the $5 my uncle gave me for helping him clean out his garage. I wrote it all down. I don't know why, it just felt important to know what I had. After high school, I got a job at a regional bank, started as a teller. I was good at it. Not because I was charming, though I like to think I was decent enough, but because I paid attention. I noticed things. I noticed when numbers were off. I noticed when something didn't add up. 3 years in, they promoted me. I was 24 years old, and I had a career and a small apartment and a savings account I was genuinely proud of. My life felt small, but it felt mine. And then Richard Whitfield walked in on a Tuesday afternoon to open a business account. He was 10 years older than me, polished, confident in the way that takes up space in a room. He wore a nice watch, not flashy, just nice, and he smiled like he already knew the ending of every story he walked into. I thought that was attractive. I was 24. I didn't yet understand that a man who thinks he knows every ending has usually already written yours for you. We dated for 2 years. We got married in 1999. I left the bank. We moved into a beautiful house in the Columbus suburbs, and I became something I had never planned to be, a woman whose whole life was inside someone else's life. I want to be clear about something, because I've heard the way people talk about women like me. I did not stop being smart when I stopped going to work. I was running a household worth $500,000 on a budget that Richard barely glanced at. I managed contractors, paid vendors, coordinated schedules for 2 kids, kept the books on 3 of Richard's development projects because his assistant quit and he needed someone he trusted. I knew every dollar that came in and went out of that house, every single one. Almost. The part I didn't know about started before Richard. It started with my grandmother, Dorothy. Dorothy Bowen was my mother's mother. She lived alone in a small house in Lancaster, Ohio. She reused paper towels. She kept her thermostat at 60 degrees in February and wore 2 sweaters instead. She drove a 1984 Buick until it absolutely would not drive anymore. She was the most quietly stubborn woman I have ever known, and I loved her more than I knew how to say. I used to visit her every Sunday when I was young. I'd bring soup or sometimes just groceries. She'd read me the newspaper, not the headlines, the local pages, the obits, the community calendar, the letters to the editor. She said that's where real life was. She never talked about money, not once. Dorothy passed away when I was 26, 2 years before I met Richard. A lawyer named Gerald Marsh, a small office in Lancaster, family practice, called me about 2 weeks after the funeral. He said Dorothy had left me something. I assumed it was the Buick. I drove to his office on a Wednesday morning. He slid a folder across his desk. I opened it. I read the number inside, and then I read it again, and then one more time. My grandmother, The woman who reused paper towels, who wore 2 sweaters in February, who never once said the word money in my presence, had left me $1.3 million. She had started saving in the early 1950s. Her own mother had died and left her $800. That was it. $800. Dorothy put it in a growth fund, added to it every year, sometimes only a little, sometimes more, and she never touched it. Not once in 50 years. No withdrawals, no panic when the market dropped, no celebration when it climbed. She just left it alone and let time do what time does when you let it. I sat in Gerald Marsh's office, and I did not cry. I think I was too stunned to cry. I thanked him, I shook his hand, I walked to my car, and I sat there for a long time. And then I thought about what Dorothy used to say to me when I was little and I'd gotten upset about something, some small thing that felt enormous at the time. She'd put her hand on my head and she'd say, very quietly, "Just wait, Caroline, just wait." I did not tell anyone, not my parents, not my sister, not my best friend Linda. I set up a private trust through a wealth management firm in Cincinnati under my maiden name, Caroline Ann Bowen, and I left it exactly where Dorothy had taught me to leave things, alone. 2 years later, I met Richard, and the trust stayed quiet, growing, slowly, invisibly, the way Dorothy had taught me things could grow if you just left them alone and stayed silent. By 2008, Richard was a different man than the one I married. The real estate crash hit him hard. Projects stalled, partners pulled out. He became secretive, coming home late, taking calls in the garage, closing his laptop when I walked into the room. I assumed the worst in the way wives do. I thought there was someone else. I was wrong about the order of things. The money came before the woman. I found it by accident. I was looking for Tyler's baseball registration receipt. That's it. That's how small the moment was. And I opened the wrong folder on Richard's desk, and I saw what he had been doing for at least 2 years. He had been moving money, quietly, carefully, through a series of LLCs I didn't recognize, protecting himself, building an exit. He wasn't planning to save the marriage. He was planning to leave it with as much as he could carry. I closed the folder, I put it back exactly where I found it, I went upstairs and I finished making dinner. I did not confront him. Not that night. Not for 3 more months. What I did instead was call Gerald Marsh. I explained the situation. He referred me to a divorce attorney in Columbus named Susan Hale, who was quiet and precise and had sharp eyes and no patience for nonsense. I met with her the following Tuesday. Susan explained Ohio law to me in plain language. Premarital assets, held in a trust under your maiden name, never commingled with marital funds, meaning never deposited into a joint account, never used to pay a marital expense, never mixed in any way with Richard's money, were almost certainly protected in a divorce proceeding. Almost certainly. I held on to those 2 words like they were solid ground. Then I called my trust manager in Cincinnati. The account had been untouched for 12 years. It had grown, steadily, quietly, the way Dorothy intended, to just under $4 million. Richard had no idea it existed. He had never asked about Dorothy. He had never asked about my life before him. Not really. Not the way you ask about someone whose story you actually want to know. He knew I had a grandmother who died. He came to the funeral for exactly 45 minutes and left because he had a meeting. His arrogance was, in the end, the only thing that protected me. Richard filed for divorce in March of 2010. He came with 3 attorneys from a large Columbus firm, and he came with a strategy: claim that I had hidden assets, put me on the defensive, make the judge look at me instead of at him. His lawyers demanded full financial disclosure. I gave it to them. Every joint account, every marital asset, every dollar that had ever passed between us, clean and complete. They subpoenaed my records. I handed over everything connected to our marriage. The trust, in the name of Caroline Ann Bowen, at a private firm in Cincinnati, established before I ever met Richard, was never surfaced. His attorneys searched for a woman named Caroline Whitfield. They found exactly what I showed them. The proceedings were long and they were brutal. Richard's lawyers argued that I had contributed nothing of real value to the marriage, that I had simply lived in a house he paid for. They used words like dependent and non-earning, and they said them in a tone that was meant to make me feel small. Susan Hale documented every contribution I had made to that household and to Richard's business over 22 years. The judge, a woman named Patricia Graves, who looked like she had seen every version of this story and was tired of it, listened carefully to both sides. Richard sat across from me in that courtroom, and he had his smile, that same tight little smile from the day he walked into my bank, the one that said he already knew the ending. The ruling came down 6 weeks later. Richard kept his business entities and his primary development property. I received the family home, the joint savings account, and 5 years of spousal support. On paper, he won. He walked out of that courthouse certain he had taken everything that mattered. He went back to his life and his attorneys and his new plans, and he gave exactly zero thought to a quiet trust account in Cincinnati he didn't know existed because he had never once in 22 years asked about my grandmother's name. The morning after the divorce was finalized, I woke up in the family home for the last time. I made coffee. I stood at the kitchen window and I looked at the backyard where Tyler and Megan had grown up, and I let myself feel all of it. The grief, the anger, the exhaustion, the shame. I gave it about 20 minutes. Then I called my trust manager. We talked for 2 hours. I asked questions I should have asked years earlier. I learned things Dorothy had understood instinctively, without a single finance class or advisor or spreadsheet. She had simply known, in the way some people know things, that the only investment strategy that never fails is time, that discipline is worth more than intelligence, that silence is not the same as weakness. I sold the family home and moved into a small rental outside Columbus. Megan was a junior in high school. Tyler was in college. I lived on spousal support and the proceeds from the house sale, and I did not touch the trust account, not yet. What I did instead was go back to school. I got a certification in financial planning, not because I needed income, though it helped, but because I wanted to understand what Dorothy had built. I wanted to be able to look at the numbers and understand them the way she had understood them, with patience, with calm, without fear. It took me about 2 years to fully understand what she had done. $800 invested in 1952, added to consistently, never withdrawn. By the time she left it to me, it had grown for 50 years. By the time I inherited it, I had let it grow for another 12 years without touching it. And now I understood in my bones, the way Dorothy had understood it, that the most powerful thing you can do with money is leave it alone. I won't tell you the exact number the trust reached because Dorothy taught me that you don't tell people what you have, but I'll tell you this. By the time Tyler got married and I set up a trust in his name, and when Megan finished graduate school and I set up one in hers, the original account was still growing, still quiet, still completely invisible to anyone who hadn't been told it existed. I set up a scholarship in Dorothy's name at a community college in Lancaster, small, quiet, for women returning to school after long absences. I still drive a sensible car, I still clip coupons out of habit, I still keep a notebook, not for dollars anymore, but for ideas, for what I'm learning, for things I want to remember. Old habits don't die, they just find new purpose. I heard through people we both knew that Richard had some hard years after the divorce, 2 more failed developments, a second marriage that also ended. I heard he was doing all right now, more or less, building something smaller than he used to build. I don't feel triumphant about that. I really don't. I feel something quieter, something more like relief. Relief that his story and my story are finally, fully separate. He never knew about Dorothy, he never found the account, and he never will, because it doesn't matter anymore. It was never about him. It was always about a woman in Lancaster, Ohio, who grew up with almost nothing and decided, quietly and without fanfare, to change that, who saved for 50 years without telling a single person, who loved her granddaughter enough to leave her not just money, but a philosophy, a way of being in the world. Stay quiet, stay patient, keep your own name on your own things. And when people underestimate you, and they always will, let them. There is no better protection than being invisible to someone who thinks they've already won. Last fall, I drove past the courthouse. Megan had an appointment nearby, and I was dropping her off. I stopped at the red light on the corner, and I looked at that parking lot, at the exact spot where I sat in my cracked windshield Honda and counted $43 and felt like my life was over. And I thought about Dorothy. I heard her voice, quiet, patient, certain. Just wait, Caroline. Just wait. I smiled. I drove on. That parking lot is where I thought my story ended. Turns out it's exactly where it began.